You can, okay. So I appreciate everybody's time. As we're talking about Active Directory security and Office 365 security today, that's interesting. The background is gone. All right, well, we'll just figure it out. So as we're talking about Active Directory security, I'm going to kind of start over a little bit since we started the recording. Attackers will require account rights and access. They can get access in a multitude of ways. A lot of times they're looking to gain access to, generally an engineer or a technician's machine so that they can sit resident and gather the necessary credential data to move laterally in the environment. And they may do that by copying TOTP. They may do that by gaining access to the shared account that's used for TOTP, like a Google Voice account, or however you are dealing with TOTP. If you have stored, rotating codes in your password manager, and that's how you're dealing with 2FA, and that's a shared account, then generally they can copy that as well, or they may, try to gain access to credential management. So it's important also to look at those platforms that you use for credential management. We highly recommend folks use, Tech ID Manager because of how it works and how it creates anonymized rotating user credentials unique to each tech and each client. That makes it incredibly hard to gain access and copy that data. If you're not using something like that, then, you just have to be, smart about how you're dealing with your, credential management. Highly recommend you use something like OneLogin if you can, SAML, integrated SSO, something like that. So as an attacker, do I need domain admin? Do not, right? As a start, as an access point, I do not necessarily need domain admin, right? It's a misconception. But in the ransomware cases where domain admin accounts are involved, almost universally, it's an unused, forgotten domain admin account. We had an attempted compromise at a client where we operate as CISO, and the attempted attack was on my domain admin account that I didn't even know they created for me, and it had never even initially been used. And so this was several years ago. It was a little embarrassing for me to try to explain how the security guy's account was under attack. So, do you have any unused admin accounts configured at your clients, right? Backup, a secondary, DA, tech that's gone, whatever, make sure that you delete those accounts, have somebody audit those. If you're not using something like Tech ID Manager, have somebody audit those for you, on a monthly basis, and remove the ones you don't need. If you're sharing a domain admin credential with your client across all your techs, please find a way to stop that right away, because it makes it incredibly difficult for a security person to figure out which engineer it is if everybody's shared the set of credentials. So again, this is interactive. So if you got something to say, speak up. How are passwords stored in Active Directory? They're hashed, right? And so that simply means that once that user creates that password, there's an algorithm that runs and transforms that password into an encrypted output known as a hash. Now, most of the time, well, they're fixed size, right? So passwords are different links will have the same number of characters. It's a one-way encryption, so they're coded. It says that nobody should be able to break that code, but we often see threat actors be able to quickly kind of hash out Active Directory credentials, all of them usually. And that's when you'll see kind of in dark web scans, if you do them, you'll see a series of passwords show up for sale, perhaps, for people in one of your client organizations. And that's usually because those credentials have been hashed. Now, we are members of a number of private Telegram groups that these threat actors operate within, and they will announce that they've compromised somebody, sometimes before they've actually kicked off the threat. And they're doing that so that they can hope to get payment quicker. But it's kind of an open community. And a lot of times we can see how they effectuated, that attack, through communications. So the question is, what's commonly running on all assets that makes hashing AD easier? It's two protocols. Anybody have any idea what those are?
SMB and NetBIOS.
Which one?
SMB and NetBIOS.
Yes, sir. NetBT is one of them.
Yep. And SMB.
SMB, right? Yeah. Well, we don't want to see that. Yeah, great answer. There's one more. Anybody know what that is?
RDP.
Yeah, that helps. If we can do that, right? So the other one is local link multicast, LLMNR. They use what's called an LLMNR poisoning attack. You go back and make sure, yeah. So if you can shut down, if you can just stop, that's why you look in your vulnerability scans and Cyber CNS, they'll point out, that these things are running. And LLMNR and NetBT are two, IPv6. You can just 86 all of those. It makes it much more difficult to compromise the environment. Now you can block IPv6. You can do it by group policy, or you can simply, if you have, firewall or switches that allow for this, you can go into switch configs and just block all IPv6 traffic. However you do it, it also makes it a lot more difficult for these threat actors to navigate using IPv6 and NetBT, which we're seeing them do lately across IoT devices. If you want to know how that works, you can just ping me and we'll have a chat and I'll explain it to you. Avenues to compromise, right? GPO permissions. They can go in, and if they want to modify GPO, if they want to modify security, they can modify GPO, to kind of own everything that's within it. Obviously, they can modify AD permissions. Improper group nesting, right? We see within groups, a lot of techs just don't understand group security at all, right? It's almost across the board. If they haven't had traditional training, that's what happens. Does anybody use AGDLP, or does anybody know what that is? It is Microsoft's recommended best practice way to create access to resources. It is the user account is in a global group. That global group is in a domain local group, usually of the same name. And the permissions to said resource, a file share or whatever it is you're doing, is assigned to the domain local group. That's AGDLP. The question is, why the hell would I do that? That's just complex and takes up time. Well, not really. The way it's designed is the group that handles permissions is one step removed from the group the user is within. So it creates that layer of isolation between the user and the permission. So you can look that up yourself if you'd like. It's AGDLP, accounts in a global in a domain local, and the permissions assigned to DL. If you can do that in your file security, it makes it very, very difficult to compromise environments that are set up that way. Over permissions accounts, we see that all the time. People who have a problem, we give them admin on their machine. They can run their app, and then off we go. And we have 300 other tickets to deal with. We'll come back and deal with those admin accounts. And it just doesn't happen. It's not because techs are being lazy. It's not because they're forgetful. It's not because they're purposefully leaving it like that. They're just overloaded with work and busy, and they don't create a follow-up to find out why that's happening. And that is another issue with application whitelisting and how you deal with that effectively. We frequently see a lot of over-permissioned accounts. People that domain admin should be, people that are local admin should be, people that are, admins of groups that are, they're in a multitude of groups that they no longer need to be a part of, or, the issue's been resolved that had them being in that group originally. Service accounts, that's another one, right? Service accounts are important. What is the number one thing you should do with a service account as far as restrictions go? What should you limit before you start using that service account? Does anybody know?
Remove interactive login access.
Exactly. Interactive login. That's the exact right answer. Kerberos delegation. What Kerberos is it's a way to share it's a way to create a connection between two disparate accounts, one in the domain and one external, or external to the current environment. So that's what Kerberos is for. And there are a number of Kerberos hashing or hacking tools that are out there. Not a lot you can do with Kerberos security. Now, that may have changed. And I'm sure there are people in this room that are far better at Active Directory management, from an IT perspective than I am at this point. So, speak up if I'm putting something out there that there's a solution for. Password vaults. Cannot tell you how many times we have seen Google passwords or passwords being hashed out of Chrome or out of the browser, unless they're using a Mac and they're using Safari and they're using, biometric based access to their credentials. There are GPOs that you can use with Chrome, but the whole idea is got to get those end user credentials out of the browser, because it's just way too easy to grab that information. If you can't get the client to pay for a password vault, like Keeper Security is a highly recommended one. Bitwarden is another highly recommended one. If you can't get the client to pay for those, then we recommend you help the client understand where they can and can't store credentials. Storing credentials in contact cards in Outlook is also not a good idea. We have seen a multitude of ransomware cases that without those hashed credentials from the browser or from contact cards, the ransomware case probably wouldn't have gone forward. The other part is making absolutely sure that your backup process is fully isolated from a permission standpoint, from your user base. And that doesn't mean that every tech needs to be a domain admin and every tech needs to be, a backup admin, and every tech needs to be Office 365 GA. A lot of RMM tools, you can do your AD updates within that RMM tool. The user, the tech usually logs into the domain controller and does it, but it can be done within the RMM tool. And that means that the service account makes that adjustment. And the audit logs for that tech's behavior is in the RMM tool. If you can work on your team's Active Directory security management where they make those AD updates, password changes, and such within your RMM tool, you're far better off than having 2, 3, 5, 10, 15 domain admin accounts for one for each tenant. When we look at real world Active Directory security, here's what we see. The workstation admins have full control on everything on that asset. They're not power users with limited rights. They are straight admins on the local machine. And that set of permissions is the most troubling because it does give the folks a footprint, right? And let me say this as clearly as I can. Do not have your engineers or techs operate as local admin on their device, period, end of story. Shift, right click, run as is simple, right? They can have an admin account. They can shift, right click, run as that application as an admin, but do not have them running as a local admin. It is the easiest way for a threat actor to gain access, sit resident. We're even seeing these hyper small VMs that they're running within the operating system of the engineer and capturing that data and those credentials. And this is the kind of stuff we see every single day, right? You cannot have your techs operate as admin. And if you're the owner of the business, you damn sure shouldn't be doing that, pardon my French. There's too much risk in doing that. Your server admins have full control over the device. Your domain admins, again, have full control over your FSMO roles, and the threat actors can really complicate the environment by making changes within FSMO, and within your FSMO roles, and you may never be able to find it because most techs don't know what FSMO is. And they don't know what the FSMO roles are in a domain. Server admins or exchange admins, I put that in there because some of you guys still have exchange servers on site. A lot of times we'll create a domain admin account for the engineers, and then they have access as local admin to all the servers as well. Again, that's hugely problematic. You can effectuate changes within an RMM tool and therefore have one service account. But, got to think of some smarter ways to deal with how you manage client devices, right? What's the other thing that happens? What is the common reaction to a tech when you remove their rights to something? Not because they've done anything wrong, you're just tightening up security. What's the common reaction?
Well, it won't be a pleasant reaction. We'll put it that way.
Say again?
They feel insulted.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're insulted. They ask, hey, you're going to fire me? Am I not doing a good job? Right? They are emotionally, and their ego is attached to their ability to, administratively navigate everywhere. And that just is unrealistic. You just, doing that is incredibly risky. And then we also see MSPs who don't run the security stack they sell. It's like, with our MSP clients, we see sometimes the MSP will run maybe the Sentinel-1 or, maybe one other platform, but they're not running the SOAR. They're not running, SAML integrated MFA or SSO. They're not running a number of tools that they sell at scale. And it's really hard to justify when the MSP is compromised as to why you didn't use the tools that are sold. And some of them are some of them are NFR, but reconsider your environment. And look, even if you're not a client of ours and you want to talk about a security review of your internal environment, we can talk to you about that. We don't make money off of helping MSPs with their internal environment. We don't do that. So just kind of remember to do, think about what you're doing there. Your help desk admins, they've got admin rights to applications, devices, SaaS environments, GA in Office 365, and all that threat actor has to do is be successful once with gaining access to that user's account, just once. And then it's incredibly difficult to play catch up at that point. Shared passwords, passwords shared between accounts, passwords shared between roles and rights, service account passwords being the same. For simplification purposes, all of that ramps up the risk. And, there's, your risk decisioning and risk scanning, as, cyber CNS adds additional components, you may see some risk scanning that, looks at how many admins you have, what's the effective rights, for an individual, number of other things that may be there. When we create these temporary admin groups, they're often permanent. When we create a user escalation to solve a problem, it's usually left as permanent. You have business owners who say, I own a company, I'm gonna run as an admin. So you got to try to deal with that the best way that you can. Third-party product permissions, requirements for those. You get your domain user access, your kind of privilege rights and AD, operating system access, that could be local admin access, given, the domain admin permissions, let's say during application or process install and not then removing them. The AD object rights, and we'll talk about GPOs here in a minute. We don't review what rights that individual needs to have. Again, I've talked to MSP owners. I'm like, look, everybody's running as an admin. You just can't do that. And the answer I got back is, I can't take that away from my techs. Everybody will get mad. And so it's a little bit of a culture adjustment. So when we're looking at what threat actors need, when we're looking at what compromises need, they generally get that footprint, and then they will use the tools, the kind of the security hacking tools that are available and are very cheap, to be able to use those tools to attempt to compromise a user environment. So if you can, from an AD perspective, if you can, it's incredibly important to kind of be able to lock those accounts down and, be able to, engage them in security, right? So really quickly, I can mention what you may see in those environments. You may see something called Hashcat, right? And Hashcat is a password cracking tool. It's accelerated by the GPU, so you can monitor GPU, CPU usage, and if it spikes incredibly high and the user's not doing anything specific, you want to pay a lot of attention to that. Metasploit, That's an exploitation framework. PowerSploit, that's PowerShell modules, that can be run to gain access to the environment. Then we use something like Empire, that's a post-exploitation agent that begins to gather that and exfiltrate that data. MCATs will pull clear text passwords in memory. So if a password is used and it's not encrypted in transit, it's clear text in memory. We can use MCATs to pull that data out of memory and then use those credentials. In Packet, there's another one that you can code to look for. You've got Bloodhound, Leprechaun, Nmap, Mass Scan, SSL Scan, ARPing, TCP dump, Responder. So you kind of get the idea. Those are kind of the apps that we see from a risk perspective used most frequently. There's common AD security issues. The local administrative passwords are not managed. The local administrative password is the same across every machine. It's not changed in any way. So then we can get the local administrator password for usually the engineer. Most times that password is not the same as the client's local administrator account passwords. But as they sit and ride with the client and they gain access, or sit and ride with the MSP and they gain access to the client, they'll hash out that local admin credential and then try it across all the machines. And most times it's successful doing that. So does anybody know what LAPS is, LAPS?
Local
Okay.
administrator password solution from Microsoft.
There you go. So that is it's a tool to manage local administrator accounts and harden those across all the machines in your domain. And pardon the delay, I'm reading some text on a compromise we're dealing with right now. But LAPS doesn't cost you anything, doesn't cost anything to deploy, and it's a good way to deal with local administrator accounts, usually enabling and disabling those. The default methodology is disabled, and then we hash those. So, your minimum password length, this is a big one. If you can make it 8, 12, 14 characters, that's usually helpful. Does anybody know what the FBI's findings were? They did a long-term study and findings on how passwords were managed in environments that had password rotations as frequently as every 15 days, with 24 remembered passwords or some, bamboozle like that. 8 character passwords rotating every 90 days with 10 password histories. Does anybody know what their recommendation was after they did the assessment on what to do with your password expirations?
Stop expiring passwords.
Say again?
Stop expiring those passwords.
There you go. So the recommendation is to increase the complexity to 12 or 14 characters, more if you can from a cultural perspective. Remembered passwords you can do those as simple as 3. We're not looking for, unique passwords. That really doesn't help a whole lot. Remembering previous passwords. And then you would if you can set the minimum password length to, longer characters, you set the complexity requirements, and then you set the expiration to 365 days or something like that. Their recommendation was complex passwords, don't force somebody to change them unless you have a reason to do so. Something happens, some concern about the user's account, change the password. Otherwise, don't do it. Question is why? Because people get inventive. Post-it notes, contact cards, notebooks, piece of paper in the wallet. Like, they are not going to remember passwords in their environment, specifically when they have something that looks like this, right? It's unrealistic. And so what we're looking for is people to have, passwords that are passphrases that they can remember, and then you leave it alone and only change it if you need to.
In fact, Jason, one of the things that came out in a lot of studies is that if you essentially have a password as a sentence rather than essentially just a word with some special characters, etc., it's far more secure than basically doing even like your hash, tilde, and number and all of those pieces. Because the number of, for example, if you took out a sentence, say you take a song, "Hit Me Baby One More Time," keep that as your password, right? It's much more difficult to essentially decode that than to decode basically something which is much shorter in 15 characters. And this will become especially true because now hackers are getting access to things like quantum computing, right? So once you get into the realm of quantum computing, your 15 characters or 18 characters is not going to cut it. So the only way to secure yourself is to essentially create long sentences that you remember, which basically can be technically very unique as compared to using your birth date or choosing some name or combination of your name or converting a O to a 0 and all of those pieces, which people have realized that can be done, and they basically are onto it right now.
Yeah. If you can get folks to use those passphrases, those sentences like, Shiv is talking about, and here's another misconception, right? If I have a password that has 11 special characters, it doesn't make a difference. Not these days anyway. So, obviously you want to meet your complexity requirements. You want to have a number, a cap, and a special character. And that's really kind of forcing them to use something that, isn't so repetitive. You can deal with repetition in your group policies. Also, these days, you can have complex password management, meaning you can have a different password requirement per group, right? So it's no longer the same password for everybody in the domain. So you can have finance, in C-suite have a different setting than the employees. If they were compromised, it really wouldn't, they wouldn't be much found there. You think about having those targeted or, those extra password policies for the people that are the highest risk to disclosure in the organization. So when we talk about, and this is a little bit more about, what Shiva was talking about, which is if we look at a password like we see here in password spray, they go across a user list and then they go across, they can even jump between machines in an attempt to use those credentials on a different machine. Active Directory doesn't care, obviously. But we can see in doing password spraying this way, there's no account lockout since one password is used in the authentication attempt for each user in the list. So they will concatenate, or not necessarily concatenate, but they'll extract the AD users, or they'll have an employee list and they'll figure out the compromised machine's AD format, first letter, first name, 6 characters of last name, or whatever it is used for the AD account. And then, they can easily list out the AD accounts and use those with the password spraying techniques. And that's can be generally pretty effective. Kind of same here when we flip one credential for the other, and we use those across the user accounts. Again, that's only one password attempt, but it's rotated across the user group. The shorter the password is, the better the spray is, right? So we can see here, password 1 p at ssw0rd, 99. All of these iterations of password will be tried first. So if any of these iterations are anywhere in your hard network hardware, your firewalls, your printer logins, and that's another thing you really got to be careful about is your printer logins. And you're using something like that, like for ESXi, maybe capital P at RT, password for root or whatever. That kind of stuff is tried first, and I'm guilty of using that kind of password with VMware, not anymore, but I used to, because it's incredibly difficult to remember it all. So the shorter the password, better the password spraying is. So if we talk about kind of your domain passwords here, this recommendation is kind of the standard recommendation for kind of Microsoft's AD security rules for banks and credit unions and such. They've not kind of caught up to the FBI's findings and recommendations. I would say if you default to what we just talked about and anybody questioned that, you could easily back that evidence up to say that that's a smarter, not so smarter, but harder overall environment. When we start talking about domain admin accounts, there's absolutely no reason any domain admin account should have, Kerberos SPN. And because, again, there's no reason for that account in and of itself to talk to and authenticate with outside resources, right? That account should be left specifically for the internal tasks that require domain admin, maybe moving your FSMO roles or, upgrading your force functional level, anything like that. So, I was talking about Kerber Toast, that's a way of compromising, let's say, the domain admin's Kerberos ticket and then using that to request user credentials, right? So another way to kind of harden your environment. The service principal name is not needed for your admin accounts, so you can 86 that if you'd like. Again, passwords that just aren't used anymore, an admin account that had been used in 9 months or something like that. It's easy to review those credentials when you're in there. It's called the tragedy of the commons usually, and that means that everybody's responsible, so nobody does it. Service accounts almost never need domain admin. Figure out why it is that service account isn't running. Spend a little bit of time to figure out why, correct that permission, and then move on. Obviously, you're going to block interactive login. So that's for the service account. And the service account just doesn't need it, right? So try to be as tight as you can with service account security. You may prevent a ransomware case for that. There are accounts that are kind of left out there. KRB TGT is an account that's used for Kerberos tickets. It's installed in every domain environment. If they get access or they can hash out the password for that KRB TGT account, then they can use that Kerberos ticket to have full control over the domain environment. And kind of changing, leaving that account disabled, or creating a very complex password for it and then disabling it. But you want to make sure that that password is as complex as you can manage. Now we're talking about these GPOs. Make sure your advanced auditing is on in your domain environment. It makes all the difference when there's a compromise. Right? The number one rule about a ransomware compromise: don't turn anything off. Don't do anything. Disconnect the internet. That's it. Don't do anything else until you find out whether they have insurance and whether they need to involve a different party and who the breach attorney is. You need to talk to your techs and train them on what to do. They will usually attempt to try to verify or solve the problem for the client. They see the compromise, a machine that's using data exfiltration. The indicator of compromise looks to them to be something fishy. And so they do a bunch of digging. Well, I would say that have them stop and have your security guy look at that series of events to see whether that's a true compromise. And that is because the more that the tech does, the less the forensics people can do their job. And they will absolutely throw you under the bus and say, hey, the engineer rebooted the machine, shut it down because he found the risk. And so we don't have what's in memory. And they will absolutely throw you under the bus. And you end up in arbitration trying to explain why you sell security without a security team, without security expertise. And that's really hard to explain. So stop, do not pass go. Have a resource. If you're not going to work with an MSSP like us, have a resource that you can reach out to when and if something happens, so that you can handle that effectively. Advanced auditing is critical, makes all the difference in the world. The default domain GPO, default domain controller GPO, these GPOs, if possible, need to have only the most basic of configurations and have subsequent GPOs not changing the default domain or default domain control GPOs. Leave those alone with very little information. Don't, in your GPO, don't link, OUs to other roles, right? If when we're talking about server admin, we're talking about schema admin, don't link those GPOs related to handling those devices and those users. Don't link them together. Create unique roles or unique groups, and those unique groups are specific for things like server admin or the like. And I'm going to speed up a little bit because I'm going to run out of time here. So let me get to the Office 365 section. And then if you guys have other questions, you can pause the video that subsequently shows up. Because I was going to kind of talk about how Kerberos works. So let's talk about Office 365, right? How do we ensure the hardening of Office 365? That's something we do with our clients frequently, is go through it and harden its access. Number one rule. Engineers, techs, owners, not global admin. Don't do it. Create an onmicrosoft.com account, have that be global admin, and have that be the only global admin. Do not use a domain account, local account, or anything like that. Use an onmicrosoft.com account as a global admin and nobody else. Figure out how to deal with that password, but it's way too risky for everybody to be global admin. You have one or two guys that deal with Office 365 or Azure administration. Doesn't matter. Don't give them an account. They can, if they fall to a phishing event or some other event, they're immediately going to look at Office 365 and they're going to lock in. They're going to, create forwarding rules and all kind of stuff. And that's why you got to have, some security visibility into Office 365 to get notified when things like that happen. We're going to talk about how we ensure the hardening of Office 365. How do you get consistency kind of across those? And one of Shiva's questions that he wanted to ask is, what's lacking? What do you feel like is lacking in Cyber CNS as it relates to Office 365? And that could also be Office 365 security. And would you find value in having Office 365 some security monitoring capabilities in Cyber CNS? And we'll answer those questions here shortly. So the approach that we deal with in addressing Office 365 security is using the secure score as a way to deal with security. Another way to do it is go into that domain, turn on the compliance manager. I think that's the name of it. There's a compliance tool in there that does very deep analytics on the security of Office 365. You can use it for a 30-day trial, turn it on, use that tool to get the deep analytics you need to harden Office 365 and then turn it off. But if you're not going to do that, have an Office 365 security tool that aggregates all of that data, until Cyber CNS adds that, but potentially add something like that as a module. And that way you don't have to have deep experience. But the number one rule is only an on Microsoft.com. And so we'll use the score. We'll prioritize what the score says is most risky, build a roadmap, and design and deploy that implementation. Use a project management tool with assigned rights. Again, tragedy of commons. Everybody's responsible, so nobody does it. You can get the kind of low user impact, low cost hardening rules, make those the changes. If there's some implementation costs, if there's some downstream effect on the hardening that you need to do, i.e. SSO, MFA, YubiKey implementation for Office 365 administration, something like that, then may take a little bit longer planning and maybe a little bit more expensive. And again, 6 months and beyond is that really difficult stuff, and none of us really deal with that because it takes too much time. So in the next few minutes, and you can come back to these slides if you'd like. Again, if you'd like to talk about hardening your environment, or you'd like to talk about or get a little bit of guidance with Office 365 hardening, you want to have that as a discussion topic, I can ask Shiva if he's comfortable with that, and we can kind of go more in depth on what that is. Thanks, Dan, for calling it fine grained password policies, because that is exactly what it is. And I did not use that term, so thank you for that. Speak up. What would you like to see in Office 365 or in Cyber CNS as it relates to Office 365? Type your message in there so we have it to refer to, but you can also speak up. Probably faster if you speak up.
So Jason, a couple of things, right? So we've already added MFA compliance into the system. We're already providing basically the standard things about users who are not logged in for extended periods of time and all of those pieces. And anything, any basically mailboxes or licenses not used, all of this is basically covered. We did basically go through the compliance manager, and to me, honestly, I felt compliance manager was a way by which Microsoft was using to force people to buy e-file licenses. That's how I actually saw that whole exercise, right? Because everything said, go buy an e-file license. So the goal, I think 3 years back, was to get everybody on an E3 license, and now they want to get everybody onto an e-file license. And then the other thing which I see very commonly is there are lots of measures that are being recommended in those, which essentially means a whole lot of from a financial perspective, a lot of outlay. And so what I did was I took a step back, saying that I'm just going to basically kind of do what is required for our MSPs in terms of like what Dennis is saying. Any new forwarding rules that come in, no new app downloads, suspicious logins. Actually, these are exactly the things that we are trying to track and basically create alerting rules on top of that and basically create audit events on top of it so that it is works for the MSPs. But again, I want everybody to basically be part of it, not just that just upgrade to E5 and that's when you get all of these fun pieces, right? So that's what we are basically kind of focusing on at this point of time. And second is that the bigger things that we are looking at is SharePoint permissions. Are there things which are being shared externally, right? And then in Teams channels, are there external people in a Teams channel in which information is being shared? So it may not be a wrong thing, but essentially we are bringing that to your attention so that you can advise the customer saying, I hope you know that you're sharing this information with these external people in your Office 365 account. So those are kind of the ways in which we're trying to basically approach this entire problem.
I had a conversation, with some of my peers yesterday in a private group that we have. And, one of the comments that somebody made is we don't want to see cyber CNS become an RMM tool. That's not what its design or role is, right? It's does a phenomenal job of making it clear what the risks are, and in the remediation plan, giving a place for people to say to their engineers and techs, live in this world, live in this page when you're not working tickets. Live in here, or live in here on 2 days a week. Fix these issues that are coming up. That make a huge difference. One last thing I'll comment on: we've partnered with a company called, and you can call them up direct. I'm not doing this from a revenue perspective, but we've partnered with a company called Device Total. And what it does is it looks at the IoT devices in your environment and rates them based upon the firmware version that's on that device, the firmware version that's available. Are there any risks between those differentiated patch variables? And uses an algorithmic number to give it a score. So each IoT device has a risk score, and you can address those IoT devices. That's maybe something you end up seeing in cyber CNS because these IoT devices are becoming the risk vector, not necessarily Windows machines or servers that are running, fairly capable MDR or XDR platforms. I think number one of the key recommendations I have personally, and it may just be because of what I do for a living, but if you're an MSP and you're providing security to your client, don't have security expertise in the house, at least get somebody who does, strong security partner, kind of in your pocket in case you need them. From an incident response perspective, at least try to have a partnership or something like that. Because if you run into a compromise, and that's when you start looking for a partner, you're going to be waiting at least a week to get anything done. And longer for forensics, right? So you just don't want to do that. And so Dennis mentioned that Cyber CNS requires a GA account for Office 365 integration. In this case, I would create a separate on Microsoft.com account for Cyber CNS, if that's required. So that they can pull the data that they need to pull. And that's more of a Microsoft thing, not a bad design thing. But that's a great question, Dennis. And if obviously the recommendation is to have a, to have a on Microsoft.com account for those accounts that need to pull data out of Office 365 or Azure. That's also like integration with RMM or PSA. That you do that.
I like to just correct one thing on that. The thing is that Cyber CNS, when it works with Office 365 and Azure AD, what we do is we create an application with a set of permissions. So when you are basically kind of going into that screen and entering your global admin username and password, it is not to give that password to us, but rather you are basically giving approval and consent to the application, and that approval and consent to the application can only be done by a global admin. So we actually have no requirement for global admin. So, but for the application to be consented to be used inside your tenant, you need to be a global admin. Perfect. So Jason, I think
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I said. Yeah, application. Yeah, that's great. So, look, it's up to Shiva kind of how these presentations kind of manifest and morph. If I'll leave it up to Shiva to kind of cue the group on what they might find valuable in the next group of presentations. We are a security team, and that's the kind of stuff that we can do. We can do this as well, but whatever I take my lead from Shiva on what he recommends we do. But we do have quite a few more coming up. And, if you have some topic ideas, please get those to Shiva, and maybe he'll be able to roll them in together. I'm not going to, I know what Shiva's working on right now and how ridiculously overloaded and busy he is. So Shiva, I appreciate you being here today, and I appreciate you giving me the time to talk my stuff with folks.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for the wonderful presentation. Just that next week, we're going to basically kind of do the session where we're going to go through all the items that were developed last month and basically kind of get it in front of the team to get approval. And then the following week is when we'll basically start the other sessions with Jason. So thanks everyone for being here today, and wonderful seeing you, all of you. Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Shiva.